how do we improve business, how do we create a market, how do we remove barriers to trade. All right, so here it is. What is the AfCFTA? Like one of the previous speakers, I also speak very fast, and when I get excited about my subject, which, as you can see, I can speak a little bit faster, but luckily you can follow with the reading. So it's the largest free trade area since the creation of the World Trade Organization. I think World Trade Organization has, 164 member states, and we are at 55 countries. With that size population, and then that combined GDP. But that combined GDP, dear colleagues, countrymen, compatriots, is not even India's, or is not even China's, and it's not even the Russians. Yeah, it's a very small fraction, and you can see what the prospects look like. Should we actually implement this agreement and gain from those expectations? So the key tools, what are the tools that we use? We use tariff reduction on most tradable goods. So I have to explain to you what a tariff reduction is. So when goods are traded, there's usually, you pay VAT. I know all of you guys, most of you are entrepreneurs. But one of the biggest barriers is that there's usually a tariff, which is a trade tool. So one of the things that we want to do is to remove the tariffs, okay? So that it becomes a little bit easier. When there's a tariff, it means that the product, again, when it reaches you, the consumer, it has that added tariff as part of the cost. So what we're trying to do with the AfCFTA is to remove 90% on all the products that we're trading within the continent. We want to reduce 90% of the products, we want to zero rate the tariffs. So that's a big deal, okay? But we also know that that's not the only thing that makes trade move. We want to liberalize trading services. So did you know, again, that most of the cost of a product is actually not the trading good, it's actually the trading services. I always like to give the example of the iPhone and the Android. I'm not discriminating, which is 69% of the value of the iPhone is not the product, it's the services. And what we think is probably the most expensive service of the iPhone? The IP, the intellectual property, the R&D, the research, the transfers, because they are made like somewhere in Korea, in the same factory as the Androids, guys. Don't get carried away, okay? And for them to get transported, the financial services involved, the logistics, that's all services. So we know that if we accompany our trade liberalization, the tariffs and the services, we will get better trade. Then there's also something very clear in trade, it's called the rules of origin. So it's my favorite. My very first exercise when I got to do trade was doing rules of origin. So that's why I have a passion for it, but it's also one of the most intricate. So the rules of origin tells you what's the economic origin of a product. Okay? I always give an example infamously about Bintu Lager, for obvious reasons. So Bintu Lager, what do you have from Bintu Lager? You've got the beer itself. And what makes that beer liquid? It's the malt and the hops. Where are they produced? Where? We import them from many places, all right? The bottle, where does the bottle come from? Somewhere, okay? And where does the top, what is it called? Yeah, where does that come from? And then the packaging, the label, where does that come from? So you understand that just that beer there is very complex. Now, what are the rules of origin? Where is the economic origin of that beer? And what we do in trade, we come up with rules where we determine what that origin would be. And what we do, we actually negotiate what that rule would be. So we have different types of rules. You have something called wholly obtained, that's my favorite. So we export beef and fish, right? So wholly obtained means it's wholly obtained from the ground of Namibia, the sea of Namibia, the air of Namibia, the factories of Namibia, everything comes from Namibia. It becomes very complicated when you get a beer and when you get manufactured and more complex products. iPhone will even be more complex, a car will even be equally complex. So these rules, we actually negotiate what those rules are. Why are these important? The rules determine where the jobs are actually made. The rules actually determine where the value is derived. Okay, so I can buy a plain jacket or just a plain thing from Germany, and then I just put a brand here, Ndiitah something. Where are the jobs and where is the value? Is it here where I just put a brand, or is it where the jacket, you have people in factories, and so rules of origin very, very important. And in this agreement, we're very, very deliberate to ensure that the rules of origin are going to support African jobs and employment, African value addition, and manufacturing. And that the value remains in Africa and that it actually assists us Africans. All right. And then identification of non-tariff barriers. This is very, very complicated. In fact, non-tariff barriers are those things that we've talked about. Most of the things that the protocols are actually trying to advance. So, for example, the food safety standards, customs procedures, technical barriers to trade, what do they call packaging instructions. So these are things that are there. And also, another one is infrastructure. I think it was mentioned by one of our speakers earlier about how it's just difficult to move from A to B. How do you get my products to Congo? And those barriers, can we remove them? Okay? And then ultimately the aim is to create one African market. Okay? That's why we're doing all of these things for all of us. All right, so how did it happen? Everybody remembers what happened in 1963? Okay, you don't remember because we're not there, but some people actually remember. All right. So we know history tells us that was the year that the Organization of African Unity was formed. And that was where the aspirations of our forefathers that crafted where we actually are today. It's because of what happened on that day in Addis Ababa that we are here today, and we can look and survey. In the background, we can see how much ground we have covered. So the AfCFTA has its origins from all of these engagements that were deliberate. It didn't just happen from one day to the next. It took a lot of time and effort. And I can only imagine what's going to happen when we are here, old people. What are we going to be looking back and what would we have done? Because our forefathers did this for us. So what are we going to do for our generations to come? And I think that's a very interesting discussion that we should be having and really being forward looking about. So ultimately, the agreement establishing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was signed on that day. I think it was signed in Kigali, right? Yeah, actually it was 2019, and it was on the 21st of March. I know that our president did not attend because it was our Independence Day. Right? So that is the evolution of how far we have gone, but ultimately, it's in the treaty of the Africa that we want, the Agenda 63. This is all part of these negotiations and all these instruments and institutions that Africa is trying to put in place for herself. The objectives are there. I think everybody has mentioned them today. We want to create a single market for goods, services, facilitated by movement of persons in order to deepen the economic integration with the African continent, and in accordance with the Pan-African vision of an integrated, prosperous, peaceful Africa, enshrined in Agenda 2063. So that's the overall objective. This is what we want. If you don't aspire, it's not going to come to fruition. And then I think I will just not bother you more. Yeah. This is when you write the small things, is when you don't want the people to pay attention. But you can continue reading what those are. The last one there, resolve the challenges of multiple and overlapping memberships and expedite the regional and continental integration processes. I think one of the things we heard earlier on, the speakers from the UN delegation talked about integration and how it's at the heart of everything that Europe does. Because in our integration is where we'll find our strengths, okay? Because we leverage on economies of scale, harmonization, and it's easier to move between one place to the next. So, did you know? Yeah, look at that. So, those are all regional, sub-regional trade agreements or agreements on our continent. Okay, I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with this. Okay, there's no problem with overlapping memberships. Agreements. I always look at the body, how, say, for example, when I run, right? I think some of you know that I run. Your muscular system, your endocrine system, your respiratory, your cardiovascular, they're all working together. So hopefully these ones, based on how they were formed and what was the basis, these are all regional integration agendas that we've had, which is very encouraging because we know that we've always wanted to integrate. So I think the only one that I thought maybe, did you know again, was that one, YM. So it's the francophones that are in ECOWAS, and they actually have an integrated currency and CMA, common monetary area. And so just imagine, so these building blocks that you have, the AfCFTA, the idea is that you actually try to harmonize all of these different building blocks. Other trade agreements or REPs, regional trade agreements, have already advanced, and there's a lot we can learn from them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, etc. So, for example, we know SACO, we are the oldest customs union, and there is a lot there that we can share with others on how a customs union operates. EAC are pretty advanced in cross-border trade. SADC, we've done very, very well with political stability. Yes. Okay, I can continue. You can help me during the. Right. Okay, IGAD, and then you have the COMESA, very big COMESA. COMESA is a common market, and of course, there are very greater levels of integration. I always like looking at one country. Which country do you think has the most common denominator? Can you find one that belongs in the most regional integrations? Can you find one? Which one?
Mauritius.
Yeah, well, which other one? Mauritius is there. Comoros, yeah, also looks like it's in a lot. Okay, yes. So you can imagine that they probably have greater capabilities to negotiate in the AfCFTA, but one of the aims is to see how do we harmonize this overlapping membership in these regional trade agreements, because remember, each one of those has its own rules. And so imagine I am a Namibian manufacturer of cosmetic products, and I want to export to one of those countries. I'll have to ensure that I meet all the rules of origin, all the tariff barriers, whatever they may be, of each and every one of them. So you understand the rationale of why we want to do this. All right. And what are the tools used? Because I think you've seen it, the what, why, how, right? So progressive elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trading goods, and then of course progressive liberalization in trading services. I'll touch on that one a little bit in the next slides. Cooperation and investment, intellectual property rights, competition policy, customs matters, trade facilitation, and trade-related areas. I don't want to bore you with all the technicalities, but this is what we actually do for a living. Establish a mechanism for dispute settlement, settlement of disputes concerning their rights and obligations. This is a really important one. It's very different from many of the other agreements that are on the continent. Because what happens with other agreements on the continent, if there's a dispute, it ends up being discussed diplomatically. You know, the heads of states have a closed tete-a-tete, and they say, please, that thing, we should remove it. Huh? But here, we actually have a dispute settlement mechanism whereby there's actually a tribunal of arbitrators that will go and look at the agreement and see who is right or who is wrong, and needs to compensate, things like that. So really rules-based, that's what we're looking at here. More than solidarity and brotherly and sisterly rule, but yes, we want it to be fair and transparent for every trader, and they need to know that it's there for you. When you are trading, you know that there is recourse to this. And then, of course, institutional frameworks to implement the administration of the AfCFTA. I'm not going to get into that, but I hope that one of my colleagues from the Secretariat might later on. So what are the expectations? These are the expectations that we're hoping. And I think the previous speakers have all mentioned that they will only remain a promise and an aspiration to the degree to which we actually do something about it. Okay? And who's we? We is the member states and the domestic policies, tools that we put in place to actually harness on this AfCFTA. So we want to create a bigger and integrated regional market for the reasons we've all mentioned before, permitting producers to benefit from economies of scale and to access cheaper raw materials and intermediate inputs. So of course, Namibia is a classic one for this one. Yeah? This one is important for us as Namibia. Why? We're a population of 2.7 million after the census next year. And if you have an investor to recoup their capex, they'll need a bigger market. Okay, so for Namibia, when an investor comes to Namibia, the NIPTB will tell you that we are not just coming to this 2.7 million, but to have the entire Africa. So that is one of the benefits, especially for the smaller countries, to attract that economies of scale. Improving conditions for forming regional value chains and integration into global value chains. You heard the minister, she was very, very articulate into that. I'm not going to mention, especially the cosmetics area. How can we all get involved in regional value chains? She went ahead and even mentioned the ones that we have in South. Giving consumer access to cheaper imports from other African countries. Ultimately, that's what we want to do. Better allocation of resources and faster economic and trade growth, catalyzing the structural transformation. This one is really, really important, dear colleagues, countrymen. We, as a continent, is endowed with these natural resources, right? But guess what? Namibia doesn't export diamonds to Botswana, to Nigeria, or to Mauritius. Where do they go? They go elsewhere. So we need to be able to find a way in which we can harness technology so that we can then start adding value, so that those consumables actually are manufactured here.